My grandkids laughed when I said I still drive myself, laughed out loud without shame, called me a dinosaur on wheels, and posted stories while I stood there holding my keys. They thought I'd forget where I parked, but I didn't. I just got in the car and drove away. And their keys? They were still in my purse. While they searched for a taxi in a city they didn't know, I was sipping coffee by the lake, alone and in silence. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Whiteley. I was 71 years old the day I realized they had stopped seeing me as someone who could drive herself anywhere. I had spent most of my life as a school nurse in Traverse City, Michigan. 3 decades of tending to scraped knees, allergic reactions, homesick kids, and shy smiles from the ones who didn't have anyone else to talk to. I wore my uniform with quiet pride and knew the name of every teacher, every janitor, every student who passed through my tiny white-walled office. Then, one day, I didn't wear it anymore. Retirement came not with relief, but with silence. At first, I found it in the mornings, the quietness of not needing to get up before sunrise, the stillness of my kitchen at 7 a.m. without the shuffle of paperwork or the click of the thermos lid. But soon, that quiet grew teeth. It gnawed at my usefulness, especially as my family got busier and I got smaller in their lives. I still had my Toyota Camry, dark green, slightly dented on the driver's side, with a fuzzy steering wheel cover my late husband had always teased me about. I kept it in good condition, oil changes, brake checks, clean windshield. I drove it to the grocery store, to the pharmacy, to the library, now and then to the cemetery. I didn't talk about it, but the car was more than transportation. It was the last space that belonged to me. My son Paul had long since taken over holiday planning. His wife Sharon was efficient in that way, deciding who would bring what, where we'd meet, when it was time to leave. I wasn't needed for anything more than showing up on time. When Paul proposed a long weekend getaway with the kids, I assumed he meant the whole family. He said it would be good for me to get out, to not be alone so much. I agreed without asking for details. I packed my bag, left the porch light on, and made sure the mail was paused for 3 days. The morning of the trip, I stood on my porch with my keys in hand. I waited for them to arrive in their large SUV, and when they did, they rolled down the window and waved cheerfully. I offered to drive behind them. Just in case you need anything, I'll be right there. Paul chuckled, looked at Sharon, then said they'd rather I just ride with them. Save gas. Be part of the group. I nodded. I didn't argue. I left my Camry in the driveway and climbed into the 3rd row, behind the kids, behind their luggage, next to a stack of folded towels and a cooler full of drinks. I wasn't asked if I needed legroom or if I got car sick. I was just added in. We drove south toward Georgia. Sharon had booked a rental house near Savannah, something picturesque and historic. The kids, Trevor and Kayla, both teenagers now, stared into their phones. They barely acknowledged me when I asked how school was going. Kayla had earbuds in. Trevor wore sunglasses even though we were inside a moving car. I watched the trees blur past, Spanish moss dangling like curtains on forgotten windows. I used to drive these roads with John years ago. We'd take turns at the wheel, argue about the map, stop for coffee in places that don't exist anymore. But now I sat in the back, invisible, while the GPS told us where to turn. Somewhere near Asheville, Paul mentioned that he was feeling tired. I perked up. I told him I could take over if he wanted a break. I saw Kayla look at her brother and snort. Trevor laughed under his breath. Sharon smiled, the kind of smile you give someone when they've said something silly but sweet. "Oh, Mom," she said. And then they moved on. No one handed me the wheel. That night at the rental house, I went to bed early. My room was on the first floor next to the laundry room with a window that didn't open. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, remembering what it felt like to drive alone at night with the windows down and the music up. I hadn't felt that in a long time. I wondered if I ever would again. Before falling asleep, I reached into my purse and touched the car keys I always kept there. Keys to a car no one believed I still deserved to drive. I held them for a long time until the hum of voices in the hallway faded, and the only sound left was the echo of old wheels turning somewhere in my mind. We had been on the road for about 2 hours when I first noticed the glances. They weren't sharp or angry. Those I could have handled? No, these were worse. They were amused. Little looks passed between Trevor and Kayla, followed by smirks, muffled laughs, and quick taps on their phones. I didn't ask what was funny. I just watched the way their fingers moved, how their thumbs flew across the screen, heads leaning toward each other in a way that said I was not part of whatever was being shared. The car was quiet except for the occasional voice from the GPS and the low volume of pop music playing from Sharon's phone. Paul drove with one hand on the wheel, the other casually resting on his knee. Sharon flipped through a travel guide she had printed out and highlighted. I sat behind them, positioned like a piece of forgotten luggage wedged between the past and the future. I shifted in my seat. My back was beginning to ache from the angle. No one asked if I needed a stop, and I didn't say anything. It had become a habit of mine, silence. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I had learned that speaking usually led to being talked over, corrected, or ignored. Sometimes all three. At a gas station just off the highway, we stopped for snacks. While the others headed toward the convenience store, I lingered by the car, stretching my legs and breathing in the heavy summer air. The heat pressed against my skin, but I welcomed it. It was real, tangible, unlike the strange hollowness I had felt all morning. Inside the store, I saw the kids showing something on a phone screen to the cashier. She laughed politely. I caught a glimpse of the photo, a blurry shot of the back of my head taken from inside the car, with a cartoonish filter added. My hair exaggerated to look wild, eyes comically enlarged. The caption said something like, "When Grandma thinks she's in Fast and Furious." I pretended not to see. I walked slowly to the coffee machines and poured myself a cup I didn't really want. On the road again, I sipped the lukewarm coffee and stared out the window. The landscape blurred into fields, then into pine trees, then into stretches of flat nothing. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. There was something tired in my face that hadn't been there before, something resigned. I wasn't angry, not yet, not even sad, just aware. Somewhere outside Macon, Paul started talking about switching drivers. His tone was light, but I could hear the fatigue in his voice. My heart stirred. This was it, my chance. I leaned forward and offered to drive. I said I'd be happy to take the wheel for a while if he needed a break. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel it, the hesitation, the unspoken judgment thick in the air. Sharon didn't say anything. Kayla and Trevor, however, erupted into muffled laughter. Trevor whispered something to his sister, who immediately pulled out her phone and began typing. Kayla looked at me and smirked. Her expression was not cruel, not intentionally. It was dismissive. The kind of look you give someone when you believe they are no longer relevant, not in a malicious way, but because you've already written them out of your story. I had seen that look before, from doctors, from strangers at grocery stores, from people who assumed the wrinkles on my face meant the wheels in my head had stopped turning. Paul politely declined my offer. He said he was fine to keep going, and I nodded. I leaned back into the seat and watched the road ahead with a fixed gaze. My hands folded on my lap, fingers twitching slightly with the memory of holding a steering wheel. I didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. As we entered the city limits of Savannah, the roads grew narrower, lined with moss-covered oaks and faded brick sidewalks. The sun had started to dip, casting long shadows over the historic homes and silent churches. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but I didn't feel part of it. I was just a passenger, an extra body they had brought along out of obligation or tradition. At the rental house, everyone rushed inside, excited to choose rooms and explore the space. I followed last, carrying my own bag. No one offered to help. I wasn't surprised. That night, while the others laughed over takeout and scrolled through pictures on their phones, I sat by the window in the guest room and looked at the street lamp outside. It flickered slightly, casting an amber glow across the sidewalk. I reached into my purse and touched my car keys. I hadn't used them in 2 days, but I still kept them with me, like a talisman, a reminder. They thought I was too old to drive, too old to be taken seriously, too old to be anything more than a burden they managed with politeness. They thought I didn't notice the laughter, but I did. I noticed everything. The house they rented was larger than I expected. 3 stories, pale yellow with black shutters and iron balconies draped in ivy. The kind of house people took pictures of from the sidewalk. It sat on a quiet street with cobblestones poking through the pavement, and all around us, the city of Savannah breathed its strange old air, something between memory and humidity. I had never been there before, but I recognized its silence. It was the same kind that settled in after everyone else had stopped needing you. Inside, I was given a room on the main floor, tucked near the back, with a small window and a ceiling fan that creaked like bones. The kids bolted upstairs to the best rooms with the views, and Sharon immediately began rearranging the kitchen, opening drawers and complaining about missing utensils. Paul brought in bags. I carried my own. The first day passed slowly. We walked the shaded streets, visited a candy shop near the river, and took photos in front of a fountain I didn't recognize. I stayed quiet, a shadow in every group picture, a step behind on every sidewalk. When we stopped for lunch, I sat at the edge of the table while the kids took selfies and added filters that made their eyes larger and their teeth whiter. I sipped iced tea and watched the condensation trail down my glass like time escaping. Later that evening, when they decided to go out again for a walking ghost tour or something like that, I declined. I told them I was tired, which was true. But I also didn't want to follow them through narrow alleys while they pretended to care about stories they were too busy recording to hear. They didn't seem disappointed. They barely reacted at all. The house emptied quickly, doors slamming behind laughter and perfume. I stood in the quiet for a long while, unsure what to do with myself. I wandered into the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and found a tin of herbal tea. I boiled water and poured it into a chipped mug, then carried it carefully through the front door and out onto the porch. The evening was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to your skin like breath. Across the street, a restaurant buzzed with life, couples dining under hanging lights, waiters in white aprons moving like ghosts through the soft blur of summer noise. I sat on the top step, tea in hand, and watched it all with the distance of someone behind glass. At some point, I reached into my purse for a tissue, and my fingers brushed the familiar weight of my car keys. I pulled them out and held them in my palm. Cold metal, slightly worn, still marked by a tiny scratch from the time I dropped them on a gravel road years ago. That car, my car, was parked just down the block, alone under a tree, exactly where Paul had left it after picking me up. I hadn't driven it since we arrived. No one had. A strange thought crossed my mind, not a reckless one, just curious. The car was mine. I had the keys. I wasn't sleepy. I knew how to get back. A walk wouldn't hurt. The mug still warm in my hand, I set it on the porch and stood. The street was empty, shadows stretching long from lamplight. I walked slowly, listening to the echo of my own steps on the uneven pavement. The city felt like it belonged to someone else, its architecture proud, its trees thick with secrets I hadn't been invited to share. But the Camry was just as I remembered it, slightly dusty, quiet, loyal. It greeted me like a forgotten friend. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door gently. The interior smelled faintly of old air freshener and sunscreen. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine hummed to life without hesitation. No sputter, no warning light, just that soft, eager sound of movement. My hands rested on the wheel for a long time before I put the car in drive. I didn't have a destination. I didn't need one. I turned the corner and let the tires carry me where they wanted. The streets unfolded slowly, unfamiliar but not threatening. They were lit by antique lamps and lined with buildings older than my memories. I passed cafes that had closed for the night, churches with iron gates, and houses with porches that looked like stages in a forgotten play. There was a stillness to Savannah at night, a kind of southern hush that didn't ask questions. The roads were mostly empty. I didn't see anyone else driving, just me, the streetlights, and the rhythmic sound of tires over brick. I rolled down the window and let the breeze touch my face. It smelled like rain and roses. At one point, I passed a corner where a violinist played beneath a tree. His case was open, but no one was around. He didn't look up. I kept driving. I didn't need to be seen. I just needed to feel the road again. I thought of all the places I had driven to in my life. Hospitals in the middle of the night, parent-teacher conferences, camping trips, grocery runs. I thought of all the times I had been the one people relied on to get them somewhere, and how easily they had forgotten. But the road hadn't forgotten. The car hadn't forgotten. And somewhere in the rhythm of rubber meeting road, I remembered myself too. I didn't drive far, just far enough, just long enough to breathe. When I turned the car around and made my way back to the house, the streets were darker, quieter, more intimate. I parked in the same spot under the tree and sat there for a while, engine off, keys in my lap. The porch light was still on. The house looked the same as when I left. I sat in the car a little longer, not ready to let go of the wheel just yet. My hands rested there, still and certain. They thought I couldn't do this anymore, that I had become a passenger, that I didn't notice the glances or the laughter, but I did. And now, for the first time in a long while, I had steered myself through the night and back again, alone, unshaken, undiminished. The next morning was unusually quiet. I woke earlier than the others, not out of habit, but out of something deeper, an unsettled energy I couldn't name. I moved through the house softly, careful not to disturb the stillness. The floorboards creaked in the hallway, but no doors opened. No one stirred. I boiled water, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the slow swirl of steam rising from the mug. The sunlight bled through the sheer curtains in warm, golden bands. Outside, the air was already heavy with heat. The city had a weight to it in the morning, like it hadn't quite let go of the night. I watched a delivery truck stop across the street, a man unload boxes, and then disappear into the back door of a bakery. Life was going on as if it didn't care who noticed. Eventually, I got dressed and stepped outside. I didn't leave a note. I didn't take my phone. I took my purse and the keys, which I had slipped from the kitchen counter the night before when no one was paying attention. They were all heading out later that day for a museum visit or a ferry ride. Something structured, loud, and full of pictures no one would look at twice once uploaded. I didn't want to be part of it. The car waited under the same tree, its surface slightly damp from the morning air. I unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the door closed. The sound it made, the soft, certain thud, felt like punctuation. I adjusted the mirrors, started the engine, and without hesitation, put it into drive. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't glance at the porch, didn't check to see if anyone was watching. There was no performance in my leaving, just movement. Pure, clean, uncomplicated motion. I turned left at the end of the street, away from the center of town. The road narrowed, lined with oak trees draped in moss that danced in the breeze like long-forgotten ghosts. I passed small homes with chipping paint and porches wrapped in vines, churches with broken windows, and graveyards shaded by weeping willows. I didn't know where I was going, and it didn't matter. I was going. The further I drove, the more the city fell away, replaced by stretches of land that felt untouched by time. Old barns leaned against themselves in open fields, fences slouched at crooked angles. The road curved gently, a ribbon of faded asphalt, and I followed it without question. There was a strange freedom in not knowing what came next. I didn't need to plan or explain. I didn't have to apologize for wanting space. I just kept going. I passed signs I didn't recognize, street names that meant nothing to me, and yet I felt no fear, only calm. The rhythm of driving returned to me like a lullaby I had once known by heart. My hands moved without thinking. My eyes scanned the horizon not for danger, but for beauty. I noticed the way the light flickered through the trees, how the sky widened the farther I drove. I let down the windows and let the air rush through the car, tangling my hair, carrying away the weight I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I stopped once at a gas station on the edge of nowhere, a small place with a broken vending machine and a dog sleeping under a bench. I bought a bottle of water, used the restroom, and walked slowly around the back of the building just to stretch my legs. The heat pressed against me like a memory, the kind you don't quite want to lose. Back in the car, I turned the ignition again and let the hum of the engine fill the silence. I didn't check the time. I didn't care how long I had been gone. There was something sacred in the solitude, not lonely, liberated. I thought about the look on Kayla's face when I had mentioned driving, the way her eyebrows had lifted in mock surprise, the half-swallowed giggle, the sideways glance at her brother. I thought about how easy it had become for people to underestimate me, to fold me into the background and forget I had once led my own life. But this was mine, this drive, this wheel, this freedom, and I didn't owe it to anyone. At some point, the road opened up to a clearing where a small lake shimmered under the morning sun. There was a gravel turnout just large enough for one car. I pulled over, cut the engine, and stepped out. The water was still. Not a single ripple moved across the surface. I stood at the edge and listened. Birds chirped softly in the distance. A breeze moved through the tall grass. I could hear my own breath. I sat on a rock and let the silence hold me. My fingers still tingled from gripping the wheel. My legs were stiff, but I didn't mind. There was nowhere to be, no one to impress, no deadline. In that moment, I realized I hadn't felt like myself in years. Not truly, not like this. All it had taken was turning the key, stepping outside the lines they drew for me, and driving away, not in anger, not in protest, but in quiet, deliberate defiance. Eventually, I would have to return, but not now, not yet. For now, I had taken the turn, the one no one saw coming, the one I didn't announce, and I hadn't looked back. The lake looked as though it had been carved into the earth by silence, not by water or wind or time, but by the sheer persistence of stillness. I stood at its edge for a long while, arms crossed loosely over my chest, watching the morning light shift across its surface like a soft curtain. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, that didn't require explanation or effort. It simply was, and for once, so was I. There was a wooden bench tucked beneath an old cypress tree, and I made my way toward it slowly, the gravel crunching under my shoes. A single dragonfly hovered in the air like a thought I had forgotten to finish. When I sat down, the bench creaked beneath me, not unpleasantly. more like a familiar greeting from something that had been waiting a long time to be noticed again. I closed my eyes and listened. The hum of insects, the distant splash of a fish breaking the surface, the whisper of the breeze threading itself through branches. I hadn't realized how much I missed sounds like these, the ones that didn't demand attention but offered comfort just by being there. I sat like that for what felt like hours. At some point, my stomach reminded me I hadn't eaten since early morning. The granola bar in my purse felt too dry even to consider, so I stood and brushed the leaves from my skirt. Just off the road beyond the tree line, I had noticed a small wooden sign for a general store and cafe. I followed the road on foot, gravel giving way to pavement, and soon enough I saw it. Paint peeling on the windowsills, a screen door barely hanging on, and a small hand-lettered chalkboard outside that read, "Coffee and Pies." The woman behind the counter had gray streaks in her hair and deep laugh lines around her mouth. She greeted me with a nod and went back to wiping the counter. I didn't speak much, just ordered a black coffee and a slice of something that turned out to be peach pie. I carried my order outside to a worn table with uneven legs, placed my tray down carefully, and sat. The first sip was enough to undo me. It was bitter and hot and imperfect, but it tasted real, like something made without expectation. The kind of coffee brewed for long drives, early mornings, or quiet retreats from people who speak too much and listen too little. I cupped the mug in both hands, letting the heat soak into my skin. I watched the small world around me continue without notice. A man in overalls walked by with a sack of feed slung over one shoulder. A girl in a yellow dress rode past on a rusted bicycle, her braids swinging with each push of the pedals. A dog barked once, then settled again beneath a parked pickup truck. None of them knew who I was. None of them cared. And in that anonymity, I felt more like myself than I had in years. The pie was sweet, a little too syrupy, but it stuck to my ribs and reminded me of church picnics and backyard birthdays. I let each bite linger, watching the lake just beyond the clearing glisten through gaps in the trees. I imagined briefly what it would be like to stay here, to rent a room above the cafe, to wake up every morning with the scent of coffee and pine, to walk the same road in the quiet hush of dawn. But I wasn't running away. Not really. I was reclaiming space, time, breath. When I finished eating, I sat for a while longer, my hand resting on the now empty mug. The woman from the counter stepped out and gave me a smile that didn't ask anything of me. She didn't offer a refill, didn't make small talk, just smiled and went back inside. I appreciated her for that. Eventually, I stood and walked back to the car. The air was warmer now, the sun stretching longer shadows across the ground. My legs moved slowly, as if not wanting to return too quickly to the reality waiting beyond the trees. But I knew I had to. I opened the car door and sank into the seat, letting the fabric mold itself around me. I took a deep breath and gripped the steering wheel, not with tension, but with recognition. My keys were still in the pocket of my purse. I held them in my palm for a long second, then slid them into the ignition. Before I turned the key, I looked at the dashboard, dusty, a little faded, but mine. I didn't know how long they'd been looking for me. I didn't know how many messages I'd missed, how many times my name had been said in irritation or worry or disbelief, but I didn't rush to check. They'd be fine. For now, I had coffee in my veins and lake air in my lungs. I had silence wrapped around my shoulders like a shawl I hadn't worn in years. I had the road in front of me, and for the first time in a long while, I had no need to ask for permission to follow it. So I did. The first vibration came just after I pulled back onto the main road. It buzzed lightly through the bottom of my purse, resting in the passenger seat, barely noticeable over the hum of the engine. I ignored it. I wasn't in the mood to be summoned. The second vibration came a few minutes later, more insistent this time. Then a third. I reached into the purse slowly, as if retrieving something fragile, and pulled out the phone. 6 missed calls, all from Paul. For a long moment, I simply looked at the screen. My reflection stared back at me faintly in the dark glass. Lines around my mouth, eyes a little tired. The same face I saw every day, but somehow different now, more awake. I didn't open the voicemail. I didn't press call back. I set the phone back down and kept driving. Another mile passed. Then the messages started. They came in quick succession, one after another, little bursts of words lighting up the screen like fireflies. Mom, where are you? Are you okay? Did you take the car? We can't find the keys. Kayla's freaking out. This isn't funny. A part of me wanted to feel guilty. Another part wanted to laugh, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. There it was, that sudden shift, the pivot from indifference to dependence, from mockery to worry. It happened faster than I thought it would. I wondered how long it took them to realize the keys were missing. Did they search the house first? The bags? Did they argue? I imagined Kayla tearing through the kitchen, Trevor blaming his sister, Paul raising his voice while Sharon tried to take control. I imagined them all spiraling in their well-furnished rental, stunned that the person they thought so incapable had outmaneuvered them with something as simple as a set of keys. The phone rang again. I let it buzz against the seat until it stopped. Then it rang again. I turned the ringer off. I didn't need the sound. The vibration was enough to feel the panic building on the other end. Eventually, the tone of the messages began to shift. Less annoyance, more urgency. We have plans today. The ferry leaves in an hour. We're stuck here, Mom. Why would you do this? I kept my eyes on the road. The trees thinned out as I approached the edge of a small town. I slowed at a red light and looked to my left. A laundromat, a diner with a faded sign, a thrift store with an American flag fluttering outside. I didn't recognize the town, but it looked like every other small town I had driven through over the years, ordinary and forgiving. A place where you could be invisible and still entirely present. The phone vibrated again, then again. Then it stopped for a long stretch of time. I imagined them regrouping, recalculating. Paul probably tried to reach a rental company. Maybe Sharon called an Uber and discovered there were none nearby. Maybe they stood outside with their arms crossed, sun pressing down, heat rising from the pavement while their patience thinned. Eventually, a new message appeared. We're worried. Just tell us you're okay. I turned into a gas station and parked under a large oak tree. I turned off the engine and sat still, listening to the tick of the cooling car. I picked up the phone and stared at the message. I could have responded. I could have reassured them, soothed them, reminded them that I was fine, just taking a drive. But something in me resisted, not out of anger, not even out of defiance. It was something quieter than that, something rooted in the simple desire to be free, just for a little longer. I got out of the car and walked inside the station. The woman behind the counter nodded, then returned to her crossword. I bought a bottle of water, a pack of gum, and a small bag of pretzels. When I stepped back outside, the heat wrapped around me like a blanket, warm and grounding. I leaned against the car and took a sip of water. Somewhere down the road, my family was pacing. Somewhere in their minds, scenarios were playing out, most of them dramatic, none of them accurate. I wasn't lost. I wasn't in danger. I hadn't had a breakdown or gotten confused or wandered off by accident. I had simply left. I opened the driver's side door, slid back in, and closed it gently behind me. The air inside was still cool. The dashboard glowed faintly as I started the engine again. I pulled out of the parking lot, back onto the road, the sun casting long beams through the trees. My hands felt steady on the wheel. The messages eventually became sporadic, one an hour. Then every couple of hours, just call me, we're worried, Please, Mom. I thought of all the times I had been an afterthought, the times my suggestions were brushed aside, my offers dismissed, my presence tolerated but not cherished. I thought of the laughter in the back seat, the filtered photos, the side glances, and I thought of how quickly all that had changed the moment I took the thing they didn't think I was capable of taking: control. The road continued on, winding through stretches of field and forest. I didn't know where it would lead me next, but for now, I didn't need a destination. The panic they felt wasn't mine. It belonged to a version of me they had constructed, one I had quietly left behind. I was moving forward, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't answering to anyone. The keys were still in my pocket when I stepped out of the car that evening. I had driven until the sunlight began to slip behind the trees, until the radio faded into static and the road narrowed into something barely paved. I didn't follow any directions. I let instinct take the wheel, trusting something ancient inside me to guide the way. I found a small motel on the outskirts of a town that barely seemed to exist, one of those places that never made it to postcards but lingered quietly on the edge of maps. The office was empty except for a man reading a newspaper and a small television mounted in the corner, playing something black and white with the volume low. He gave me a key attached to a long plastic tag with the number 7 scrawled on it in fading marker. I paid in cash. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer explanations. I carried my small bag to the room and closed the door behind me with a soft click. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old fabric. The bedspread was floral and heavy. There was a dresser with a mirror, a small table with one chair, and a window that looked out onto a cracked parking lot. I stood there for a while in the quiet, letting the stillness settle around me like a second skin. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the car keys. I turned them over in my hand, slowly, feeling the cool metal press into my fingers. I thought about how casually they had been left on the counter, how no one had noticed when I picked them up, how certain they had been that I wouldn't need them, wouldn't dare to use them. I thought about how light they felt now, not just physically, but symbolically. They were a reminder of what I had taken back, quietly and completely. I placed them on the table and sat down in the chair. I stared at them for a long time, my mind drifting through memories like smoke. I thought about the first car I ever owned, a used station wagon with rust along the wheel wells and a radio that only worked if you hit the dashboard just right. I remembered how proud I felt driving it home. Windows down, music playing, hair flying wild in the wind. That car had been freedom, possibility, the beginning of something. Now, decades later, a different set of keys lay in front of me, but the feeling was the same. The quiet power of knowing I could go anywhere, do anything, on my own terms. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The parking lot was still empty except for my car, sitting under the dim yellow glow of a flickering light. There was something almost regal about it, as though it had been waiting patiently for me to remember who I was. I boiled water in the room's small coffee pot and made a cup of tea. I drank it slowly, watching the steam curl upward, breathing in the scent of something familiar and comforting. I didn't check my phone. I didn't care if the messages had stopped or multiplied. I wasn't ready to give them my time yet. Later, I changed into pajamas and folded my clothes neatly at the foot of the bed. I slid the keys under the pillow, not because I was afraid of losing them, but because I wanted them close. They were no longer just for a vehicle. They were proof that I still had access to something I thought had been taken from me a long time ago: autonomy. Lying in bed, I listened to the distant hum of traffic from a nearby road, the soft creak of the building settling around me, the occasional chirp of a bird outside. The motel felt like a cocoon, a space carved out from the noise and chaos of obligation. I thought about how they must have looked earlier that day, checking their pockets, tearing through bags, pacing in circles. The confusion, then the frustration, then the realization, not just that I had left, but that I had done so without asking. There was something about that shift, about taking back control without confrontation, that made me feel more powerful than any argument ever could have. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I didn't need to explain myself to be justified. The keys were mine. The car was mine. The choice was mine. Sleep came slowly but peacefully. I let my mind drift toward the next day, not with anxiety, but with curiosity. I didn't know where I would go. I didn't know how long I would stay gone. But I knew with absolute certainty that I didn't owe anyone a timeline. In the dark, I reached under the pillow and touched the keys one last time. They were warm now, molded to the shape of my palm, familiar as breath. I smiled into the silence. For once, the world felt perfectly still, and in that stillness I felt seen, not by anyone else, but by myself. I woke before the sun rose. The motel room was dim and still, and for a long time I lay there listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a plastic clock mounted crookedly above the bathroom door. I didn't feel rushed. There was no itinerary, no obligation pulling me into the day. I moved slowly, the way people move when they finally remember the morning belongs to them. I showered, dressed, and brewed another weak cup of motel coffee. I drank it standing by the window, watching as the darkness outside began to pale. The street in front of the motel remained quiet. No footsteps, no engines, no movement. Just a soft blush of light spreading along the rooftops and the breeze nudging an empty soda cup across the parking lot. I gathered my things into the small overnight bag I'd brought, folded the bedspread back into place, and smoothed the pillow I had slept on. I reached under it, retrieved the car keys, and held them for a moment. The metal was cold but comforting. A weight that meant something now. I slipped them into my coat pocket, not for safekeeping, but because I liked the feeling of them there. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth and pine. The car waited in the same spot, bathed in the pale light of early morning. I unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door gently. It felt like stepping into a secret, a quiet little world that only existed when I was behind the wheel. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat in the stillness and let myself arrive fully in the moment. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, my eyes on the horizon. The town beyond the motel was still asleep, its sidewalks empty, its porches quiet. There was something sacred about that emptiness, something that made it feel like the entire world had paused just long enough for me to breathe. Eventually, I drove. Not far, not fast, just enough to feel the road beneath me, to hear the soft roll of tires on asphalt. I passed shuttered storefronts and boarded windows, faded signs with missing letters, and mailboxes leaning like tired sentinels. The world was gently waking up, but it hadn't noticed me yet. I was still invisible in the way I wanted to be. I found a narrow street that curved gently through a neighborhood of old houses, with wide porches and overgrown gardens. It looked like a place where time moved slower, where days folded into each other like worn quilts. I parked near the end of the street and stepped out of the car. The pavement was damp from the night. Leaves stuck to my shoes as I walked. The air carried the scent of something sweet, honeysuckle maybe, or the last breath of a flowering tree. I wandered without direction, hands in my pockets, the keys clinking softly with each step. There were no people, no dogs barking, no televisions blaring through windows, just me, the breeze, and the quiet rhythm of my feet. It felt like the kind of street that had stories embedded in its sidewalks. a child's chalk drawing still faintly visible on the edge of a driveway, a wind chime moving gently above a porch, a faded welcome mat that said, "Come back soon." I didn't know who lived in these homes, and I didn't want to. It was enough just to be there, to be in a place untouched by the noise I had left behind. I sat on a bench near the corner. It faced an old church with flaking paint and a crooked steeple. Birds flitted between branches above me. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. My shoulders relaxed. My thoughts stopped racing. For the first time in a long while, I felt entirely where I was. I thought about returning, about walking back into that house and pretending none of this had happened. I imagined their faces, relief, confusion, perhaps a little anger. I pictured the questions, the attempts at gentle reprimand disguised as concern. But none of that felt urgent anymore. None of it felt like mine to carry. There was something about the stillness of the street that made it clear. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to prove that I had been right to take the keys, to take the drive, to take the time. The act had spoken for itself. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the echo of a boundary drawn and held. I walked back to the car slowly. The sky had lightened to a soft gray blue. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower coughed to life, a sign that the day had begun for others, but I was still in a space just before that beginning. I started the engine, rolled down the windows, and let the morning air wash over me. As I drove down that quiet street, no one watched from behind curtains. No one called out. No one interrupted the silence with expectation. I passed porches with rocking chairs that remained still, gardens that rustled gently but made no demands. A world that let me pass without requiring anything from me. And as I turned onto the main road, I realized something simple and profound. I hadn't run away. I had walked down a street without footsteps, and I had left something behind. Not a place, not people, but the version of myself that always waited to be told what came next. This time, I decided. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted from soft morning gray to a deep, honeyed blue, and the air held that kind of warmth that settled into your bones. Not hot, just steady and familiar. I had been driving without direction for most of the day, letting the road guide me like a lazy stream. My phone remained silent, tucked in the glove compartment. I hadn't looked at it since the night before. The quiet inside the car was the kind that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I passed a green sign that read, Hazel Grove, Pop, 1734, and something about the name pulled at me. It sounded gentle, a place untouched by the urgency of the world I'd left behind. I turned off the main road and followed a narrow 2-lane street that curved gently through fields and clusters of trees. The town unfolded slowly, no sudden sprawl, no strip malls or neon signs. Just a gas station, a feed store, a diner with a handwritten open sign, and a little library shaped like a house on a stick outside someone's front yard. I parked across from a small cafe that sat at the corner of 2 quiet streets. The awning was striped and faded, and a few planters full of dusty marigolds framed the entrance. Inside, the windows glowed gold with the reflection of late-day sun. I didn't go in at first. I just sat in the car and watched the way the light filtered through the leaves and danced across the dashboard. There was something about Hazel Grove that made me feel as though I'd been there before. Not in any real sense. I was certain I hadn't. But in the way it reminded me of pieces from other places, other moments. The diner where John and I used to stop on the way to his parents' cabin. The gas station where I once sat with a map unfolded across my lap, circling towns we'd never get to. The porch swing where I rocked my son when he was still small enough to fit against my chest. I stepped out of the car and walked down the street slowly. The sidewalk was cracked in places, and tufts of grass poked through like soft rebellions. I passed a barber shop with a striped pole still spinning, a thrift store with a mannequin in the window, wearing a church dress from another decade, and a drugstore that looked like it hadn't changed its layout since 1955. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to be somewhere that didn't expect me to hurry. At the far end of the block, I found a small park. It wasn't much, just a bench, a few trees, a stone fountain with no water running. But it was quiet. I sat on the bench and let the weight of the day settle into my limbs. I looked up at the canopy of leaves above me, at the way the light flickered through them like a film reel skipping frames. There were no voices, no footsteps, no engines, just the soft rustling of branches and the occasional chirp of a bird that hadn't yet left for the evening. For a while, I let myself imagine staying there, renting one of the small brick houses I'd passed, with a garden out back and a clothesline strung between two trees, waking up early and walking to the cafe for coffee, sitting on a porch and watching the mailman wave as he passed. A life without noise, without apology, but I knew I wouldn't stay. Hazel Grove wasn't mine, not really. It was a point on the map, a place to pause, not to plant roots. I didn't need permanence, I needed a moment, and the town had given me that. As the shadows grew longer and the sky deepened to a richer blue, I walked back to the car. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, looking out across the quiet street. The kind of street where people nodded to each other, not because they had to, but because it was built into the rhythm of the place, where time didn't chase you, where you could sit, breathe, and not be missed in any urgent way. Before I got in, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notebook I always kept with me, even when I had nothing to write. I flipped to a clean page and drew a tiny dot. Then, next to it, I wrote Hazel Grove. I didn't add the date. I didn't need to. The day had imprinted itself in a way that would never fade. I started the engine and let it hum for a minute before pulling back onto the road. As I drove out of town, I glanced once in the rearview mirror, but the buildings had already begun to fade into the trees. I didn't feel sad. I felt complete. They would be waiting for me eventually, wherever I decided to go next. The messages might pile up, the questions would come, but they would arrive at the version of me who had made a choice, not the woman they thought they could shuttle around or laugh at from the back seat. Somewhere behind me, a house still sat with a table set for dinner, and someone was probably asking where I'd gone. But ahead of me, there was a road, a sky, and the steady sound of a car moving forward. And in my pocket, the keys didn't feel like keys anymore. They felt like mine. I drove through the fading light with no map, no music, and no plan except to keep moving forward. The sky behind me shifted from gold to mauve, then into that soft, deep indigo that only appears at the edge of true night. The world was exhaling. Shadows stretched across fields and farmhouses blinked their porch lights to life one by one. Each mile I drove felt like a slow shedding of something that no longer fit, a skin I had worn for years without questioning whether it was still mine. The radio remained off. I didn't want someone else's voice filling the air. For once, I didn't want to absorb the opinions, lyrics, or stories of others. I wanted to sit fully in my own company, hear the rhythm of my breath, feel the quiet weight of my thoughts. The silence inside the car was not heavy. It was sacred. It felt like a room I had finally returned to after being away too long. The steering wheel fit my hands like it always had. Familiar, certain, mine. I had driven countless roads in my life, taken countless turns for the sake of others. Children, husband, work, routines. I had always carried the invisible map of duty in my head. This was different. There was no route, no one waiting, no one directing, only me choosing again and again to continue. I thought about how easily people began making decisions on my behalf. It didn't come all at once. It was a slow erosion. One day someone carried my bag without asking. Another day they told me to rest while they drove. Then came suggestions to take it easy, comments about how things weren't like they used to be. Each moment small enough to ignore, but together they built a cage. I hadn't noticed it at first. I had nodded, smiled, thanked them. I thought they were being kind. But somewhere along the line, their concern became confinement. My abilities weren't gone. They were just quietly taken from me, one polite gesture at a time. Now, driving through this endless hush of twilight, I realized how long I had been grieving something I never named. Not youth, not health, but freedom. And how simple it was to reclaim it. I turned a key. I drove. I left. I passed through an open field where the land stretched so wide I felt like I could see the shape of the earth itself. I slowed the car to a near crawl just to stay in that moment longer. The windows were down, and the wind tangled my hair and cooled my skin. I felt alive in a way that was not loud, not thrilling, but grounded, real. Eventually, I found a gravel road leading away from the main highway. I didn't hesitate. It pulled me in like an old memory. The tires shifted beneath me, crunching softly over stone and dust. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Trees formed a loose arch overhead, their leaves rustling like whispers. There were no streetlights, no signs, only the night and the path. At the end of the road was a clearing. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The sudden quiet was full-bodied, almost physical. Above me, the stars had taken their places, scattered but certain, familiar but always new. I stood still, breathing in the cool air scented with pine and damp earth. The sky above me felt like a cathedral. I dug my hands into the pockets of my coat and touched the car keys. They didn't feel like an object anymore. They felt like proof of ownership, of defiance, of survival. I closed my fingers around them and stood there a little longer, letting the moment expand. I began to think about what came next, not with dread or pressure, but curiosity. Maybe I would keep driving for a few more days, finding small towns and quiet rooms where I could write letters I never sent. Maybe I'd stop at a motel near the ocean and listen to the waves until morning. Maybe I'd return home eventually, not because I was expected to, but because I chose it, on my terms. I knew there would be messages waiting, missed calls, hurt feelings wrapped in concern. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel the need to explain. What I had done was not dramatic. It was necessary. They needed to remember who I was before they decided who I wasn't. When I returned to the car and sat behind the wheel, I took my time. I ran my fingers over the dash, over the familiar imperfections in the plastic, the tiny chip in the gear shift that had been there since the beginning. The seat still remembered the shape of me. I turned the key. The engine hummed quietly, faithfully. I let the headlights sweep across the trees as the dust stirred. In the rearview mirror, the clearing began to fade behind me. But something stayed. As I eased back onto the gravel road, I felt the future open ahead of me, not like a wall, but like a hallway, not a destination, but a direction. I was not lost. I was not confused. I was not fragile. I was behind the wheel. And in that moment, with no one watching, with no need to prove a thing to anyone, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. I remember who I am, and I'm not done yet.